Welcome to Unlocking a Healthy Mind. This is a conversation between a neurosurgeon and a holistic pediatrician. My name is Pejman Katarai. I'm a holistic pediatrician with over 15 years of experience in integrative medicine.
And I'm Mark Argentiano, a neurosurgeon with decades of experience. And like Dr. K, I have a passion for understanding how the mind works. So much so, I wrote a book about it. And we want to welcome you to our podcast, our series of informal discussions about how to unlock your healthy mind.
So, what do you think? What do you think of social media? That's what we're going to be talking about today. Do you think that children should be banned from using social media?
You know what? That's a provocative thing to say, and I think I personally think it may be going a little far. Um, and I definitely want to get into the discussion more, but as sort of a top line thing, my own personal way of raising my own kids, I have three kids who are now grown now, is really to give them as much agency as possible. So there is no end to the number of bad things in the world that might be tempting to them, be them social media, which I think is an addictive and overall not great thing. But you can't just stop at that. With sugary foods, fried foods, drugs, alcohol, bad friends, what have you. So the way that I look at it is more to give them a sense of agency, to talk to them as if they're a little older than they really are, tell them what I think of it, and listen to what they have to say as if their voice counts, which it does. That's my perspective. Do you have, what's your perspective on it?
I would 100% agree. You know, as you were sharing that, what really came up for me is really just instilling certain thoughts and mindsets and values in children, and empowering them and educating them early on in terms of what is healthy for them and not. And that's part of what I love about the families that I work with, where the children, like I have children in my practice, just giving another example of something addictive. These children are taught like sugar is not good for you. And when they go to a party and there's cupcakes and whatever else, and this is also the norm for our house, like the kids will go and take a bite of a cupcake and be like, oh, okay, that was cool, and then they move on. And I think, to your point, trying to shut everything out of everyone's lives is perhaps not the best way to go at it. But I also believe we also need to be careful, because young children early on, and it blows me away that there are 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds who have iPhones and they're on TikTok and Instagram. And, frankly speaking, I have a hard time wrapping my head around that, because I don't believe children at that age have the agency to really be able to understand what it is. And to your point, social media is addictive. Like, I mean, they've built these platforms and these applications to be addictive. Like there's no, way of talking around that. And to expose an 8-year-old to that is probably not the wisest move as a parent. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, 100%. And I 100% agree with you. And your perspective I'd like to get your perspective as a board certified doctor who deals with kids, a board certified pediatrician, in addition to your work as a holistic pediatrician for the kids who have other issues or even not other issues. Just your general take on the 2016 American Academy of Pediatric Guidelines. So what they said, if a kid is younger than 18 months, they should have no screen time. Forgetting about social media, just no screen time, with the exception of video chatting with grandparents who might not be around, or parents who might not be around, or siblings, so forth. From 18 to 24 months is when they suggested introducing digital media, and they specifically said watch quality programming like PBS Kids or Sesame Workshop, and the parent should be watching it with them. And then from 2 to 5 years, they said limit the screen time to 1 hour per day, and same thing, watch with them. And they wanted that as a baseline. And then after that, they did a similar thing that, as we're talking about, you'd mentioned sugar and I'd mentioned sugar, like use it sparingly as if you would use a dessert or a movie or anything else after the age of 5. Do you have any thoughts on that, or?
I think that those recommendations are spot on. I mean, I think in the ideal world, right, the imaginary world that unfortunately is mostly imaginary for most families, is there would be like no media. I can say for our household, like that's not realistic. And for children living in a world where their friends are watching TV and they're on apps like that's hard. Now there are some schools like Waldorf schools where they just ban media for all children, but for the general population, I don't know if that's totally realistic. And a lot of parents, want to have something where it's like, you know what, I'm going to give my kid a few hours. That's pretty much what we do for our household. And I can tell you, if the media for, let's say, a 4-year-old little guy gets dialed up a notch or two, and generally during the week, we don't even have them watch anything, no iPad, no TV. And we find that they're a lot calmer. And on the weekends, when they do get TV, iPad, whatever, at times, if it's more than an hour, they become more reactive and irritable. So I think those recommendations are absolutely spot on, and it's perfectly formulated, where it's realistic and kind of grounded, but still protecting the child's health and well-being.
And for the patient population, that's as a parent, and I get that. Or for you as a professional when dealing with healthy kids. I mean, I think that would be, would you change that recommendation dealing with different types of patient populations as you might see in your holistic practice?
Yes. I appreciate the point you're bringing up. So for healthy kids who have the ability to regulate themselves, I think these recommendations generally stand. I can also tell you, I work with a large population of children with, pretty severe anxiety disorders, OCD, aggression, irritability, autism spectrum. And in those children, especially certain types of media exposure, forget about the video games, like some of those older children that are playing Fortnite or, any of Minecraft, it's scary to see how their nervous systems react. Because, like, for instance, Minecraft, which all, especially younger boys love, it's addictive. And parents, like, I've had families where 11 o'clock at night, they saw the child like steal the iPad and was up playing Minecraft as if it was an addiction. So I would say for children who have underlying neurological behavioral challenges, media needs to be carefully exposure needs to be really curated and done in a very careful fashion, because a lot of those kids do not do well with any kind of media. Maybe like a PBS Kids, maybe some kind of very, just gentle moving animal kind of nature show. But like, for instance, some of those video games, like some of the things that are on YouTube, like they're so stimulating for these children that their nervous systems just have a hard time winding down.
Yeah, that's interesting, and that's an interesting perspective. Um, I also, I don't have the same sort of personalized experience with any kids, and my kids are old enough that they grew up before this was so pervasive. They did have cell phones at middle school age, but even then, it was for my oldest one, it was still the kind of cell phone where if you wanted to enter a message, you'd have to press the button, 3 times to get the right letter and stuff like that. So they're definitely of a different stage. So I don't have the personal experience nor the professional experience you have. So I definitely appreciate your perspective on it. But one of the things I did or looked up or talked about, and I know that you know that I have a book out and I talk more about this kind of stuff in the book. It was a 2020 study performed by neuroscientists in Ohio. And so the doctors looked at 47 pre-kindergarten age children and they used specialized MRI studies. Now, everyone, I hope everyone, or I believe everyone watching and listening to us will know what an MRI study is, but they do MRI studies in different ways now. And this specific MRI study was something called a diffusion tensor imaging. And what that allows the MRI to do is to allow the doctors to see how the signals flow down individual nerve cables. Nerve cables are called axons, neuronal axons. So what they did is they took a bunch of kids, pre-kindergarten age kids, who had exceeded the AAP guidelines, the guidelines we discussed earlier, American Academy of Pediatrics, and they saw that in the kids who were glued to the screens too much or whose parents used the screens as electronic babysitters without them around, the white matter tracks, those cables, the insulation around the cables, which is called myelin, was malformed, and the tracks themselves were disorganized. And the doctors, or it's in a little bit of an alarming study, which shows that too much screen time can physically alter the structure of the brain. And then they tested the kids and found that those same children exhibited worse language and literacy skills. So it's not only behavior, it's cognition and anatomical changes. So I think that's interesting, and it sort of goes along with what you're saying about the kids who maybe don't have the right tools to start. I think we both, thankfully, we're both take pride in our involvement as parents. So our kids have benefited from that in that they're not just going to be sat in front of a screen like that. But unfortunately, not every kid is so lucky. And a lot of kids, as we were talking about earlier, don't have behavioral issues, and they also might have their own tools which aren't available. And it just, I guess, makes it a dichotomy, and the kids who don't have the good start get worse and worse,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah. It's a little terrifying when you think about some of these, anatomical changes. And as you're sharing that, what comes to me are I believe several studies that are out there that have explored the link between early media exposure and ADHD and inattention and other elements of distractibility. And as a neurosurgeon and I would consider you, even though you're not frankly like neuroscientist, but you've certainly done a lot of research in that area. How would you correlate what they found on those MRI studies with other elements such as attention, focus, and so forth?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great study. Great question. And I think, and it's a really good intro to the next thing that I looked at, which is something called the ABCD study. So the National Institute of Health in England, they had the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study. So the way they looked at it when they set it up was a 10-year study of teenage brains. And they did regular exams, they did cognitive tests, and they did MRI all across Great Britain. And then it's still ongoing. I mean, it's not done yet. It's a work in progress. The whole 10 years haven't gone by. But to answer your question directly, they said the same thing. They said, hey, can doing this can spending too much time on the screen cause behavioral abnormalities and things like that. So the kids who uh, had more than 7 hours a day of video game time or screen or other screen time, they had lower scores on thinking tests, on language tests, and they had increased behavioral problems, significantly so in the mental health arenas of depression and anxiety. So more than 11,000 9 and 10-year-old kids were involved. So that's not little numbers. It's not just a few kids here and there. It's a real study. And if they're watching too much on the screen or playing too much on the screen to develop, and it was associated with they developing depression, anxiety, other types of behavioral problems. It interfered with their sleep and it wrecked their academic performance. So that's a big study. It's ongoing, and it speaks right to the point that we're getting at.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, as you stand back and you think about these things, I mean, as a parent, it becomes, I hate to use the word terrifying, but it becomes challenging to really dial all of this in, right? Because there's all the social pressures that children have to, interact. And I mean, without social media, you and I wouldn't be able to get our message out, right? So I think there's definitely benefits to social media, and some of the elements of connecting and sharing and so forth are obviously productive, but it's also terrifying as a parent to think of how these children are impacted. And sadly, it's not just like, oh, they're going to watch a little bit of TV and that's the end, and they just get bored, especially when social media comes into the picture, right? Which is a totally different beast from this passive thing you're watching on TV, a movie, a cartoon show. With social media, it's a little disturbing in terms of how good of a job they have done to make it addictive. And lots of studies out there, obviously, that kind of look at these things. And I think it'll be worth us also talking about what happens with the bullying and all of those other things. But I'll just give you an example. Like early on, when I had gotten on Instagram and I had started posting videos, and I was using the app regularly, I started looking at what was happening to me, where it was like, oh my God, did this person like what I posted? Oh my God, did this person give me a like? And like it got to the point where I started noticing myself becoming addicted to this friggin' app, and it scared the hell out of me. And I'm a supposedly mature, wise, holistic pediatrician that takes care of these people, so I should have the wherewithal. But like, I actually could see myself as an adult getting hooked into this. And
Yeah,
it's a little scary in terms of just the addictive nature to these applications.
yeah, 100%. And one of the things that you said that I think is super interesting, maybe alluded to the fact that it might not all be bad. Um, Along those lines, have you, in dealing with the patient population that you deal with, ever had the occasion or the ability to sort of use it to your advantage in a therapeutic way to actually help the kids that are afflicted with some of these problems? Or can you, even if you haven't done it yourself, can you envision some way that we might be able to harness it as a tool rather than because I think a lot of things we're going to say about it are bad rather than good. So I'd love if there's a good thing to say to get that perspective.
In terms of social media.
Social media, or you'd mentioned Minecraft before, so perhaps there are some games, video game type
Yeah.
things that if a kid is suffering from anxiety or having problems with ADHD or even autism, something that can be therapeutic.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I think putting social media aside for a second, because I think outside of allowing children to, engage and connect with one another, which, these days, digital media ways of connecting is part of the norm, right? Which I think for us adults is still a little foreign. But you know, a lot of children socialize on video games. They socialize through social media. So for them, that is one way. And I think as long as it's done in a controlled, careful fashion, that there may be some benefits there. There are a lot of amazing apps. There are multiple video games, for instance, that actually tie mindfulness into the actual design of the game. And if the child is, some of them have actual biofeedback sensors,
Mm.
some of them don't. But there are a lot of remarkable games out there where they actually build mindfulness practices and mindfulness elements into the game. And at the end of the day, like those games, those applications have tremendous value. And for some children who have anxiety, whatever else, you know, I've actually said, hey, like, I think one of the games is called Mightier. Uh, so there's so many different wonderful, you know, applications out there that can be enormously helpful. Now, are they as cool and, you know, borderline addictive as Minecraft? Probably not, but I think there's a lot of utility and benefit. And I'll give you an example of something that I recommend to our families. There's a application called Khan Academy, which I think they've
Mm.
done such an exceptional job building. And like my son, you know, the little bit of iPad time that he gets in the week is on Khan Academy, and he's learning to read. He's learning to read through that app. And you know, my daughter, I think half of what she learned of math and reading was actually using this app. And it's beautifully created. There's very little stimulation, and it's all in a very kind of grounded, educationally focused, developmentally appropriate uh, manner. So I think there's a lot of benefit that can be had, but parents need to be very mindful and very careful.
Yeah, I'll second what you said on the Khan Academy. I know my kids when they got older, especially for sort of complex math and physics stuff. So so they were still in high school. So at the AP level in math, certain math and physics, the Khan Academy videos were actually super helpful. They were like YouTube videos. Maybe there, you mentioned that, and you mentioned something else. Maybe we could link to them in the description.
Sure.
The other thing, just along those same lines, is if anybody listening had, first of all, if you like it, comment, share, subscribe would be wonderful. But if you have any comments and questions or things that you'd like to hear more about, please let us know in the comment section of the whatever platform you happen to be watching this on. Um, yeah, so the I do think that one of the things that's going on lately and is the Senate hearings where they're calling up the different social media companies. Have you read anything about that or heard anything about that?
I mean, I wish I had the time to watch the entire
Ah,
hearing. I did read a little bit about it, and really, at the end of the day, what's driving that are these families whose children, I mean, multiple children, I believe, committed suicide because of the cyberbullying, and you know, a lot of the very, very negative aspects of social media. And you know, perhaps that's something we can explore, because god, like, growing up as a child in just non-social media world is hard enough. uh when you have these other platforms, and there were multiple discussions around Snapchat, where the bullying happens on Snapchat because, you know, children can send other children very demeaning, very destructive messages, and they feel fine doing it because their message disappears and supposedly no one could pay attention. And the amount of bullying and harm that's happening as a result of that is, I mean, genuinely saddening.
yeah, you mentioned suicide, which is obviously the worst of all, and there have been several well-designed studies that have shown that the rate of suicide has increased order of magnitude, which means 10 times in teenage girls since the introduction of widespread social media. And, some of the social media companies might argue and do argue, well, it could just be a coincidence. Um, it might be an association, correlation, not causality. They'd say that they don't cause it. But there was a 2023 article, so just last year, of middle school age children that laid out some scary findings. So more than 150 kids, they were 12 years old or so, in rural North Carolina schools. So they specifically surveyed them regarding Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and they stratified them. So some of these kids checked the social media one time or fewer per day. And then the other kids were just totally glued to the screens, checking them more than 20 times a day. And those researchers then performed what's called functional MRI, which is a little different than the other one we talked about, which is the diffusion tensor imaging. Just for the audience, I'm sure you know, of course, but a regular MRI takes a picture of the brain. You can see the anatomy, but a functional MRI actually sees which parts of the brain are active. It has a manner in which to do that. So they looked at these kids. It was a long study. It was 3 years. So they did psychological questions, the functional MRIs every year for 3 years. And they revealed that the kids who were checking their social media too often, that most highly stratified group, checking it 20 times a day or more, they entered a pathological psychological state. So they just swung from joy to dread. They were either craving positive reinforcement, or they were fearing any kind of disapproval that was mirrored in their screens. And you identified it yourself. You're like, look, I'm a grown man. And I've said the same thing. Like, sometimes you post something because you and I think, want to get our messages out via social media. So you post something, and if it falls flat, you feel shitty for a while, and you're like, and why should we? It's stupid, but it's true. And so imagine how much more with kids. So the fMRI showed 4 parts of the brain that were really diminished in activity, or really elevated in activity, depending on the part of the brain. So one part of the brain was the amygdala. So the amygdala, for, again, our listeners, viewers, is part of the limbic system, which is the emotional part of the brain. The other part that was altered was something called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So that's part of the executive function, a decision-making function part of the brain. Then the other parts that people might not be as familiar with is something called the insula. The insula part is a part of the brain that's responsible for the emotional guidance of social behavior. And then part of the brain that was really effective was the ventral striatum. So the ventral striatum is between the limbic system, which is the emotional part of the brain, and the reptilian part of the brain, the most basal level of survival. They call it that because it's the same as it would be in alligator in our mind. And it's the highest part of the reptilian brain that almost touches the limbic system part of the brain. And that was totally altered. That was totally altered. So, I mean, it speaks to sort of what we're saying. If you had to pick, of all the ones, so between, say, TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook, I know you said that the Snapchat was bad, but I think that it's less pervasive than the TikTok, Instagram, or Facebook. What would your sense in your either self, family, practice be the most addictive of all them, or the most harmful of all?
I don't know if we know the answer to that. I am guessing that they're kind of jockeying each other to be essentially the most addictive. I mean, that's what their intention is, right? At the end of the day, like social media is marketing, and that's to sell stuff, right? That's how they generate revenue, right? So the more effective their systems are in hooking people in to then promote the sale of something, the better their application is doing. uh the way I contextualize these platforms is it's more if by some miracle if a parent can curate what their child is interacting with, and who are they interacting with, what are they seeing, what are they getting exposed to, which is easier said than done. But I think the content that they ultimately get hit with is probably the most significant thing. And like as an example, like my kids do not have access to YouTube because it scares me. Even YouTube Kids, like the odd things that sometimes pop up, like before when I didn't know better, and there were studies that had touched on this, so I should have known better. But a few times, the kids had somehow pulled up YouTube and they were watching something, and then we had literally stepped away for 5 minutes, and we come and we're like, what the hell is this? To the point where now there are no YouTube apps on the iPad. Our TV cannot access it. Like YouTube has just been banned from our house because of that. Now, I have a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old, so it's a little bit of a different story in terms of what we can and cannot control. But I think ultimately the content and the individuals who are, creating some of the interactions are to me more important than, is it YouTube or is it TikTok or Instagram or Facebook?
What was like the weirdest thing that ever came up, or let's say the weirdest or most shocking thing that ever came up when your 4 or 7-year-old? Was it something like akin to like pornography adjacent, violence adjacent, or something totally different that led you to take the step to say it's not in my house when they're this age?
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, it wasn't anything horrible, but there are certainly many reports of all of a sudden, these very distorted people putting supposedly child content, and it's something terrifying or something destructive. For us, it was just they somehow meandered from the one show they were watching into something that did have some elements of violence, if I remember correctly. But it's one of those things where you're introducing a level of variability that you can't control, even though
Mm.
you think you're controlling it. And I think that that's the hardest part is being a parent today, right? Like 2 decades ago, like there wasn't this kind of pressure. There was, some channels on TV you could watch. There were some shows and movies you can watch. Yeah, we misbehaved and watched, movies that were probably more violent than what were good for us. But like that was the extent of it. Like parenting today is just so much harder because there's so many things you have to be mindful of and so many things you have to control. And especially if you've got a child that, is craving additional interaction, and they see their friends on it and they're like, why can't I be on TikTok? My friends are on TikTok or whatever else. It becomes so difficult.
Yeah, no, I'm totally with you. And one of, as you're speaking, I'm thinking of the differences as they're littler and they get bigger, and you see some of these things that sort of start out as, you might say, cool and end up being awful. So there was some challenge where a celebrity would pour a bucket of cold water on their own head to make increase awareness for X disease. I remember that was going around for a while, but it morphed into a lot of really dark things. And I think viewers might remember, or listeners might remember, the whole Tide Pod challenge where they're challenging each other to swallow a Tide Pod. Tide Pod are those little
Mhm.
things you should throw in the dishwasher. If you swallow it, I can only imagine it's pretty terrible for you. And one of the things that came up with TikTok, maybe it was in 2021. So in 2021, all of these prestigious children's emergency rooms started identifying what they called an epidemic of Tourette syndrome and in teenage girls. So for people who might not know what Tourette syndrome is, Tourette syndrome is something called a tic. And some tics are where you like blink your eye, you can't control it, or move an arm and can't control it. The additional thing in Tourette's is you also have these verbal tics. So you spew verbal sewage, such as cursing or yelling or something like that. So it's totally frightening. So you can imagine these teenage girls started showing up in Canadian and American emergency rooms with what looked to be Tourette's, which was identified as Tourette's by the doctors. And they were concerned enough, they started calling each other and going to conferences about it. And they were wondering, is there some new toxin in the environment? Is it just something? They had no idea. They threw their hands up until one of them uh, determined that it was this TikTok thing where they were doing hashtag Tourette's. The girls at this age were doing hashtag Tourette's and mimicking the symptoms. And some of these hashtag Tourette's were viewed billions of times. And then, what that becomes is something, another doctor word that the audience may or may not know is something called Munchausen syndrome. So it's not really that they had Tourette syndrome, it's that they had something called Munchausen syndrome. Munchausen syndrome is where is where someone who's completely healthy takes on all of the veneer of a disease for secondary psychological gain. And maybe you could say that in a different way or better than I can. If you can, please do. But I don't know people with stuff like that.
I think what you said is perfect. That basically they take on that disease manifestation, but it's a psychological disease manifestation. But as you're sharing this, what comes up for me is I'd say about 10% of the population of kids that I take care of do have motor tics, and I'm not aware of studies, I'm sure they're out there, that have looked at this, but I can tell you clinically that in these children, when they do get exposed to a certain amount of social media, their motor tics start increasing, pretty substantially. So I think, there's the Munchausen's piece, so just a psychological thing, but I think just the neuro excitation that this creates in these children, right? It's so activating to their nervous system that through that you get all kinds of other odd things. We touched about ADHD and inattention. You touched on all of these remarkable studies that cause structural physiological change. But it just activates the nervous system. I mean, if we distill it down, like, it distorts and activates the nervous system in very, very unproductive ways.
Yeah, you're absolutely 100% right. And another study specifically with Instagram, the scientists watched while the kids or teenagers were scrolling up and down their Instagram feeds, and they saw that the reward system of the brain lit up. So the electronic devices were stimulating the release of dopamine. And everybody's heard of dopamine. It's like the reward chemical and so forth. So very much like a sugar high, what would happen is as they're scrolling, the dopamine shot through the roof. But as soon as they finished their scrolls of whatever they're going to look at, or were done with the phone or the laptop, whatever they were doing, it was like a sugar high where they just um, fell off the edge, and they're reported an enormous amount of sleep disturbance and depression in the kids like that.
And this is on top of all of the other things you mentioned in that, I believe, the functional MRI study where, the limbic system is distorted. So the fear response is changed, like emotional regulation centers are changed, executive functioning is changed. So it, like, as you compound all of these things on top of one another, it really brings forth this picture of how problematic, and I mean, I hate to use the word, potentially, I should kind of put it as potentially destructive or harmful that these platforms can be if they're utilized in a way that's not appropriate or carefully monitored.
Mm, yeah, no, 100%. And along the same lines, because we talked on TikTok, and Instagram. So Facebook, there was a specific Facebook study from 2017, which showed in 28 young people around 20 years old that were addicted to Facebook, they did what's called a volumetric MRI, which looked at volumetric MRI looks at the size of a different structure. And they showed that in those people, young people, so 20 somethings. So we've moved from little kids to middle schoolers to teenagers and now 20 somethings. In these 20 somethings, the amygdala, which again is part of that limbic system, the emotional part of the brain, the fear responses you just said, um, they showed that there was reduced size, atrophy, wasting away of that specific area. So, that's Facebook addiction, if you will. So it's all the social media, but it's not just social media, it's smartphones in general. So there's a German study showing that even smartphone addiction, even if you're not addicted to social media, the other things we're talking about, video games, whatever the kids or grown-ups are doing on that, also results in atrophy in some of these areas we're talking about previously, the insular cortex, which is that part of the brain that's active in guiding, emotional guiding of decision making. And it even starts to have trouble in the inferior temporal cortex. The temporal lobe is above our ears. The inferior part of the temporal lobe, it's not called inferior because it's less good than superior, it's just lower than the superior. It wasted away. And that was in the area of the brain that helps recognize patterns and faces and objects. So some there's some real there's some real damage going on. I think, I'm sure what people who have been kind enough to listen this far and stick with us this far, watch us this far, would really want to know is, hey, what can I do about this? Either what can I do about this? What should I do about this? Either for my kid, or as it turns out, as we're talking, not only about your kid, but for yourself. So, what solutions might you have to offer some people to walk away from our discussion with some actionable things that they might be able to do?
You read my mind, Mark. I think you and I are having telepathy because I was just
Ah,
about to say pretty much the same thing. Uh, Here's how I would approach it. I would look, if you contextualize these platforms as addictive substances, and you just say, you know what, there's no if and or but about it, they're addictive. But at the same time, the reality is that my kid, especially if they're older, we're not talking 7, 8, 9 year olds. As far as I see it, and what's going to be the rule for our family is, for our children, until they're at least 10, 11 years of age and they have the wherewithal and awareness, like, we have no intention of getting our daughter a phone, and we have no intention of letting her get on social media, even though she's going to hate us in a few years. But I think if you look at it as how destructive and addictive these platforms are, I mean, in my opinion, as a pediatrician and as a consultant that works with these families whose kids have, awful issues, I don't think children have the ability to really manage themselves at that age, even if you put whatever restrictions on these apps that they claim are sufficient. I think for older children, if you say, you know what, my 12-year-old, 14-year-old needs some of this because this is now part of the norm of how these young people socialize, but there are very tight rules around it. And you look at it as an addictive substance, whether it's sugar or, whatever else, it could be looked at as a drug. And in this case, it's like a drug or a substance that is addicting, but sadly is a part of the normal social milieu and way in which these individuals and children and young people interact. So how can I allow it to be where my child can have some social healthy connections and interactions that will be fruitful and productive? And how do I set limits where if that starts becoming distorted and now I can see that my child is addicted and they're constantly trying to go after their phone and their mood and behavioral changes. And, for me, like in my practice, I'm constantly scanning all the kids in my practice, and are they thriving? Are they thriving in school? Do they have an easy time learning? Are they enjoying learning? Are they socializing well with their friends? Are they, in a healthy, robust place? And if the answer is yes, and social media is contributing to that, so be it. An hour or two a day, ideally an hour, is fine. And if anything, it's being used in a productive way. If that starts distorting and now the product, the beneficial elements are now turning into this addictive, destructive, my child is starting to become depressed, they're starting to become irritable. Academically, there's distortion, executive functioning is falling apart, whatever. That's when I would put the brake on things and say, you know what, this has gone south and this is becoming harmful, and I love you and you're going to hate me, but we can't do this. I'd love your take.
Yeah, I like but we're very much on the same page. I think the one thing I might add to it, a few things I might add to it on both ends is one is as soon as you can give them agency because they will be exposed to all these harmful things. They will be exposed to alcohol. They will be exposed to drugs. And certain ones are awful and you hope they never do it, like heroin. I don't think there's anyone who's like, I hope my kid tries heroin. But on the other end of the spectrum, alcohol, I like a glass of wine with a cocktail with a friend, or a nice glass of wine with a good steak. I mean, I love those things and I hope my kids enjoy that too. But alcohol is an addictive substance. So you have to have a healthy relationship to things that could be entertaining, but also could be bad for you. Gambling. I mean, no one wants to say, "Oh yeah, I gambled away all my money," but a lot of people say, "Hey, let's go watch the horses together, and we'll bet here or there." So, there has to be a healthy way to handle it, and there has to be a certain amount of parenting or guidance that goes in. But for people who totally become addictive and can't help themselves, maybe part of the answer is these industries that are causing the addiction, like the social media companies and the smartphone companies, should be obligated to put aside some money so that there are something like a quote unquote Alcoholics Anonymous system in place that's free to anyone who would want to use it. It should be sort of part of the tax on that industry, in my opinion. Um, the one had a good, yeah, I'm sorry, you go ahead.
No, I think all of that makes sense. As you're saying this, part of the Senate hearing that I was reading about, where people, associating this Senate hearing to one of the first, hearings they had on the tobacco industry, and how early on the tobacco industry was like, no, our products are safe, our products are fine, they don't cause harm. And obviously we came to know better. And the only difference is obviously smoking cigarettes is never beneficial, and it's never like, oh yeah, if my child has one cigarette a day, it's okay.
Yeah,
But
right.
I think, as we start as a society and as a community start looking at it in that way, where this is a necessary evil, if you want to say. And if done in a controlled way, with your child having agency and a parent really watching things, there could be some benefits. But people also have to start looking at this as they can be highly destructive and highly addictive.
Yeah, no, I think that's first of all, I think I really like if you have other things to say, that's great, but I really like how you sort of and I hope you do have other things to say if you'd like, but I really like sort of that ending sort of on a very positive note, because it isn't like cigarettes or heroin. There are benefits to it. You had pointed out a few of these apps that are actually really good, and a few video um, that might be very educational and so forth. It's hard to say, oh, I got too much of the Khan Academy, for instance, one we both know about. But the good news that I sort of would want to end on, and again, I'd love to hear anything else you have to say, is that researchers at Penn, University of Pennsylvania, which is dear to my heart, that's where I went to medical school, they investigated the psychological changes caused by electronic addiction among college students. So they studied their own student population, and they showed that this addiction caused loneliness and depression at a much greater rate than you'd expect. The good news part of it is that all it took was limiting it to 30 minutes a day, so they didn't have to cut it out entirely. They limited it to 30 minutes a day for 3 weeks, and a lot of those adverse psychological changes reverse themselves. So if you use it, it seems to me that if you use it in moderation, similar to a glass of wine, it's not going to hurt, and it could enrich your life, and that, it's just a way to unwind. So
And I love that as an ending. And I think it really kind of opens the door of just the more awareness we need to have around this. And, I think as more and more people talk about this, and more parents just open their eyes to what really is this. And, at times it's hard to say no to your child because they really, really want something. But at the end of the day, if this is something for their mental, emotional, and frankly, physical health, then you have to do what you have to do. And, one thing that I would love to leave people with is don't be afraid to feel empowered to take control of your child's health and well-being. And if your child momentarily dislikes you or frankly hates you because you're cutting off what they see as their lifeline to their societal connections, but you are understanding that the harm that this is causing, physical harm, emotional harm, etc., feel free to do what you know in your heart is right to protect your child. Because I see so many parents feeling disempowered and feeling that they don't have the power to do what they know is right because they're scared, because they're afraid. But at the end of the day, we need parents to feel that they can and they should. And you're doing this to protect your child and to protect their well-being. And I mean, what's more important than that, right?
yeah, I love that. So not only give your kids agency, um, you're giving the parents agency. I love that. That's great. That really is really nice.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we thank you all for watching. We thank you for taking the time to be a part of this discussion. And please subscribe and share this with others. We have a lot more topics coming and a lot of things we'll be discussing.